According to Resident Evil Village's producer Pete Fabiano, the recently released Resident Evil Village demo was originally only supposed to be a visual tour that would allow you to explore a small section of the game, Dimitrescu Castle. But the developers eventually decided to evolve the experience to include a short story, some scares, a couple of items, and classic puzzle-solving elements. And so, the Resident Evil Village Maiden demo was born. In Maiden, you don't play as the protagonist of Resident Evil Village. The main character of the Maiden demo doesn't even have a name. You can't fight, you can't block attacks. Literally all you can do is observe, collect clues, and open doors. Sounds pretty limiting on paper, but this simple approach is extremely effective. It strips away all the bells and whistles and complications that a full-release franchise game brings, and allows players to focus on simply looking around and enjoying the atmosphere. Enjoying being a relative term. It may not tell us much about what the final game is actually going to be like to play, but horror game demos are often like that. An entirely different experience unto themselves. And, you know, sometimes, just sometimes, that experience is better than the finished product. If you recall, Capcom had a rather ingenious approach to demos around the launch of Resident Evil 7 in late 2016 to early 2017. The so-called Beginning Hour demo was updated several times ahead of the game's launch. It could be completed quickly for those who were just casually curious, but for players hungry for a little extra, the demo not only had multiple endings and 5 murder clues to solve, but it rewarded sleuths with an exclusive item that could be brought over to the main game, the Dirty Coin. That coin was simply an extra token that could be used to, ever so slightly, more quickly unlock optional items in the final release. But mystery around its meaning and its use pre-launch only added to its allure. I think these demos, and a few others besides, demonstrate a fundamental truth about horror games. Less is very often more. Players don't need to be in danger or be actively chased in order to feel dread or terror. Often, they don't even need to see what's hunting them, or indeed, even really be in peril in the first place. For demos especially, there's a lot of power in the unknown, which is why these condensed experiences can be even scarier than the games they're created for. Now, let's take perhaps one of the most famous demos ever as an example, PT. A playable teaser released on the PS4 in August 2014 as a free download, PT was an instant hit. When it was announced as part of a Gamescom showcase, people were told it was from an unknown developer called 7780S Studios. But upon downloading from the PlayStation Network and loading it up, it was clear that this was no indie production. Taking place entirely within one short, looping L-shaped corridor and 2 small adjoining rooms, PT was the definition of doing a lot with very little. In terms of actual interaction, you could do even less than in both of the most recent Resident Evil demos. You could walk, and you could zoom in to examine objects more closely. That was it. So, in other words, you were completely at the mercy of whatever this corridor threw at you. And by the way, it is a stroke of genius that everything did take place in a corridor. I mean, what is so scary about a corridor in a fairly mundane-looking family home? Well, everything, it turns out. As the corridor twists and changes with every single loop, the mundane becomes the monstrous, and familiar sights like a telephone or a digital clock take on an ominous new air. It was clear that PT delighted in this simplified language, as it kept scares subtle but effective, with the lone ghost Lisa present but never overbearing. The simplicity never led to staleness though, and in fact seemed to provide the developer with new ideas. PT even toyed with the gaming medium specifically by pretending at one point to experience a bug. I mean, this could have caused players to log off or complain, but the development team were clearly game to take the chance. It also hid clues essential for story progression within the pause screen, squeezing innovation and intrigue out of every possible asset and making the impact of each one count. And there's definitely a mission statement somewhere in letting players know that the pause screen, usually a place where you can consider yourself safe, is anything but. Once you solved all the clues, which could take quite some time, and unlocked the ending cutscene, where the game revealed itself to be a Hideo Kojima production for a new Silent Hill game, it finishes everything up with a screen that simply says, "This game is a teaser. It has no direct relation to the main title." The final game, in other words, might not be anything like this. Of course, the final game we never actually got to experience, due to Kojima parting ways with Konami not long after. And though he did team up with Norman Reedus and Guillermo del Toro for Death Stranding, we will never know what the game Silent Hills might have been like. Truth time? I don't think it would ever have lived up to the standard PT set for it. PT was great because it had nothing to do with Silent Hills, nothing to do with Kojima, nothing to do with anything. Players had zero expectations going in, and had no preconceived notions of who Lisa was, what happened in this house, and what fate was in store for the player character. Even if the scenes in PT made it into the final Silent Hills game, because of the very nature of gaming, all of those elements would probably have lost their ability to scare eventually. The final game would have had to have been at least 20 or 30 hours long, in which time the main character would end up armed to the teeth with guns. Lisa would have suffered from overexposure as we got cutscene after cutscene of her origins, her tragic life, and then 3 subsequent boss battles as she slowly morphs from pale woman in a dress to pulsating hell demon / analogy for the player character's grief or trauma, while we empty all our ammunition into her glowing weak spots. Instead, we got one perfect 20 to 40 minute long experience that both terrifies us and leaves us clamoring for more. Look, the truth is, horror games are just less scary once you understand their mechanics and how they work. As soon as you start to think tactically about how to dispatch enemies, as soon as you start to try and exploit their animations or cheese their attacks in any way, you are not scared. And when you start to recognize the pace of a game or typical horror tropes, you start to second guess and predict where the story will end up. And all of that kind of becomes inevitable the longer you play something. With a demo, there's no chance for any of that because, well, 1, there's no time, and 2, those answers simply might not exist. Plus, the nature of demos being kind of throwaway means your safety and fate as the player character is never assured. You might assume that Ethan Winters survives Resident Evil 7 because he's the main character, but the same can't be said for the anonymous maiden in Resident Evil Village. That gives developers the chance to be a bit more imaginative, twisting or subverting a player's expectations of what this game is going to be. I mean, the game may not live up to those expectations, of course. We're much more forgiving of a demo's faults than the final versions. There's always an unspoken acceptance that a demo is limited in what it can offer, that it's part of a work in progress, and that it therefore represents potential that's yet to be fulfilled. And of course, it also helps that it's free. But no matter how polished or unpolished a demo looks technically, the beauty of horror game demos in particular is that your imagination can run wild when you're only shown a tiny slice of the overall story. Mysteries are presented, but nothing is over-explained. so players can imagine what they hope the game will be, and no one can prove them wrong. And this goes even further when you're talking about demos for games like Resident Evil, because fans of that long-established series will of course be looking for clues, connections, and secret meanings in literally every darkened corner. Who doesn't love a good bit of video game conspiracy theory? It doesn't matter how far-fetched the theories are because it's just fun to do. And until the main game comes out, no one can definitively prove you wrong. Now look, we haven't lost sight of the fact that a demo is basically an advert, and one that doesn't always paint an accurate picture of the product that it's selling. But as the Resident Evil Maiden demo has proved, that doesn't mean people can't have a lot of fun with it, and that the demo can become more than its creators ever expected of it. With a free demo, you have huge potential for audiences to stream, and with horror games in particular, you have streamers looking for those big, exciting reactions and jump scares, maybe involving some sort of tall vampire lady. And with horror games often comes puzzle-solving elements, where players and streamers collaborate looking for clues, just like with PT. Of course, the danger of all this massive free publicity is that it then leads to these huge, expansive theories that aren't and were never actually planned to be fulfilled by the main game, and then everybody gets angry that their own personal interpretation of what the game was isn't fulfilled exactly as they expected, and then they review bomb the final product into oblivion. And so on it goes. But I'm still hung up on what these demos are, brilliant little self-contained horror experiences, versus what they become. Bloated great monstrosities featuring bloated great monstrosities with glowing orange weak points for you to mindlessly shoot until the credits roll. Early access horror games like Visage and Phasmophobia are probably the closest I've come in recent years to experiencing my favourite sort of horror. They take a small and seemingly familiar location, like a haunted house, and change it subtly behind the player's back. Or they make the thing stalking you almost impossible to predict. They are technically jankier by comparison, but I'd say their scares are far more genuine. I would love a studio like Capcom to really commit to that kind of horror game, without feeling the need to go all out on bombast and secret hidden laboratories in the final act. Give me something more quiet, subdued, and utterly understated any day. But until then, sexy goth vampire ladies are alright too, I guess. So what would your perfect horror experience be? Do you prefer indie horror stories to big studio blockbusters? I want to know. And mostly because if there are great horror games out there that I haven't played yet, I really need to get on that. Subscribe to Eurogamer if you haven't already for lots more horror videos and Resident Evil updates. More videos of that sort are on screen now. Thanks for watching. Bye!